They say that in Linden, when the mist still hugs the river and the town is half awake, you can hear a siren echo from the old Fort Eldridge Penitentiary. No one pulls the switch. No one stands guard there anymore. But just before sunrise, that sound drifts across the water thin, mournful like the place itself, remembering what happened. The story begins on a morning like any other, when men went to work, children to school, and the air smelled of diesel, damp earth, and coffee. Inside Fort Eldridge, Officer Kenton Reed was starting his shift. 24 years old, new to the service, and still believing the rules could hold back madness. He checked logs, ticked logbooks, kept his tone clipped and polite. To him, the prison was a machine steel ribs, concrete breath, and a heart that beat on schedule. But that morning, something in its rhythm had changed. The inmates were whispering again. They talked about a wind that could open any gate, about freedom waiting in the shadows of cell block C. Most officers laughed it off, but one man didn't. Levi King, tall, lean, eyes like a thundercloud. When Kenton passed his cell, Levi leaned close to the bars and said, "Guardman, the gate is going to forget who it's serving today." Kenton forced a smile, pretending not to feel the chill that ran through him. At the front checkpoint, Officer Martin Doyle signed the duty sheet. 42, quiet, dependable, the kind of man who never raised his voice. Inside his locker were 2 drawings, taped side by side. Crayon, stick figures of himself, done by his 6-year-old twins, Maya and Miles. They were his whole world, the reason he kept showing up to a job that rarely said, "Thank you." He looked at their drawings, smiled, and told himself he'd stop at the shop for pencils on his way home. Routine thoughts, the kind a man has before his world changes. The first shot snapped through the compound. Then another, and another. Radios screamed. Boots thundered on concrete. Kenton stumbled from the laundry bay, his hand pressed to his chest, blood blooming through his uniform. Behind him came 5 shadows. Levi King, Nigel Croft, Eldon Pace, Corey Vale, and Randall Hughes, faces hard, eyes burning, moving like one body. From the gatehouse window, Martin saw them coming. He didn't think. He reached for the alarm lever. The bullet found him first. He fell sideways, glass shattering above him, and the siren's scream swallowed the sound of everything else. By the time help arrived, the 5 men were gone. Some said they hijacked a car by the Bauxite Road. Others swore they slipped through the swamp. But everyone remembered that sound, the siren wailing against the calm of the morning, rolling down the river and into the sleeping town. And miles away, in a small house near Mackenzie, 2 children paused over their breakfast, as if something far off had whispered their father's name. By midday, the sky had gone the color of dull tin, and the sound of sirens rolled up the valley like thunder trapped in a drum. News spread faster than the breeze that moved through the pines. 5 men loose from Fort Eldridge. 5 armed shadows with nothing left to lose. Every corner shop, every minibus stand, every old transistor radio on the Linden Highway whispered the same name, Levi King. Some said he'd worked obeah from behind his cell wall. Others swore he'd bribed his way through the locks. But those who'd looked him in the eye knew better. Levi King didn't need magic. He carried his own kind of curse, the kind that walks on 2 legs and smiles at fear. At the edge of the city, the 5 men tore through back roads, slick with morning rain. They moved with the madness of hunted animals. The sedan they'd taken groaned beneath them, mud spraying off its tires like blood in motion. When the petrol needle hit empty, They ditched it beside an old bauxite trench and vanished into the bush behind Wismar Hill. There, under the dripping canopy, they stopped to breathe, or try to. Steam rose from their clothes. The air smelled of gun oil and wet clay. Nigel Croft cursed under his breath. Corey Vale wiped mud from the pistol. And Levi King just stood there, eyes half closed, face turned to the sky. He said, "The city thinks we're monsters. But remember, a monster is just a man who stopped waiting for mercy." No one answered. They didn't have to. They were already too far gone for mercy to matter. Back in town, the National Peace Service set up roadblocks from Mackenzie Strait down to Aituni. Every vehicle was searched. Every stranger's face questioned under the hard eye of suspicion. At Fort Eldridge, officers moved like ghosts among the wreckage. Shell casings glittered on the wet concrete. Blood smeared the tiles near the gatehouse. Kenton Reed's cap lay half submerged in a puddle, and beside it, the shattered glass where Martin Doyle had fallen. The warden stood silent, a cigarette trembling between his fingers. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "Find them before night. If they make it to the bush, we'll be hunting spirits, not men." Downriver, in Rockstone Village, a woman named Tasha Briggs closed her shop early. She'd heard the news on a scratchy radio. She didn't believe it at first. Then she saw them. 5 figures emerging from the track behind her house, mud-soaked, breathing heavy, eyes wide as lanterns. She barely had time to scream. Levi King raised his hand not to strike, but to calm her. His voice soft and dangerous, like water before a flood. "We're not here to harm you, miss. We just need the car. Hand over the keys, keep quiet, and live." Her baby cried from inside the house. That sound, the small, helpless wail, seemed to reach something deep, even in those hardened men. Randall Hughes turned his face away. Within minutes, they were gone again, her car tearing down the track toward the Linden Highway, its rear lights bleeding into the fog. When the police found her later, she was shaking, still holding the tin cup she'd dropped when they appeared. That night, the rain came harder. It hammered zinc and flooded drains, and Linden felt smaller, as if the whole town had pulled a blanket over its head and waited. The radio said the fugitives were armed, desperate, cornered near the river. But the old folks at the rum shops whispered something different. That Fort Eldridge had opened not by man, but by the restless dead who wanted company again. Some believed it. Others just crossed themselves and locked their doors. By midnight, the searchlights were sweeping the bush. Dogs barked, soldiers shouted orders drowned by rain. And deep in that black maze of vines and mud, 5 shapes moved like phantoms, chased by the glow of torches that never quite found them. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river waited brown, wide, indifferent. And above it all, the siren of Fort Eldridge cried again, long after the power had been cut. By the second night, fear had found its way into every corner of Linden. It crept through shop fronts and backyards, slid beneath zinc roofs, and into the prayers of tired families. People started talking to the dark, asking it to stay outside their doors. The newspapers couldn't keep up. Every hour brought a new sighting. 5 men seen crossing the Demerara River by canoe. 5 men stealing food from a roadside stall near Aituni. 5 men hiding in an abandoned sawmill on the outskirts of Batka. Too many stories, too many shadows. But one thing was certain. Wherever the 5 passed, trouble followed. In a wooden house at the end of Wisrock Road, a woman dreamed of gunfire. She woke to find her curtains moving, though the window was closed. Outside, The dogs howled, not the barking of warning, but the long, trembling kind that carries sorrow. By morning, she was gone. No one knows if she ran, or if something darker called her name. The next day, a truck driver swore he saw Levi King near the Kera Kera Creek. Said he stopped to offer help, but when the man turned, his eyes were wrong, too calm, too certain. The driver reversed without a word and never spoke of it again. Across the coast, the National Peace Service called it a coordinated manhunt. But in the rum shops, men said it plainly. They are hunting demons now. Even the officers stopped pretending. They moved in groups, their nerves strung tight like a fishing line, their fingers always close to the trigger. They knew what the public didn't, that Fort Eldridge hadn't just lost prisoners, it had lost control. Up in Mackenzie, Officer Martin Doyle's twins, Maya and Miles, asked their grandmother why the phone kept ringing at night. She told them not to worry, said their father had gone to work far away, someplace where heroes go when they're tired. The truth, of course, was harder. The Doyle family had become a name whispered in sympathy. Neighbors left food on their step, and the church rang its bell for Martin on the third morning. But no one could look those twins in the eye without feeling something twist inside. Meanwhile, in New Amsterdam, the escapees had split up. The bush had swallowed them, but not evenly. Some said 2 made for the river, 2 for the city, and 1, the quiet one, Randall Hughes, stayed behind near the abandoned sugar factory, sleeping in the shells of old cane carts. They say Randall prayed every night. He wasn't like the others. He still carried a photograph of his mother, a woman with tired eyes and folded arms, standing in front of a blue house. He would take it out when the others weren't looking, press it to his lips, and whisper, "I didn't mean for this." But the bush doesn't listen to apologies. By week's end, the National Peace Service patrols reached as far as Burbis. The newspapers called them armed and dangerous. The people called them something else, the 5 of Fort Eldridge. Old women began to leave rum and matches at crossroads, hoping to confuse their spirits should they die in sin. Children weren't allowed to play after sunset. And in Bartica, a pastor told his congregation that the jailbreak had opened a door between the living and the damned. He wasn't wrong, not entirely. The first shootout came on a Saturday night near the Lusignan Bucklands. Soldiers surrounded a cane field after hearing movement. When they entered, the stalks were still wet from rain, and the only thing they found was a half-burned shirt, its pockets stitched with a prison number. They didn't know it yet, but Eldon Pace was already gone, shot by his own man during a quarrel over a stolen watch. His body sank into the mud, and the others left him there for the swamp to claim. The legend says that when the search team passed through days later, they heard humming, a low, broken tune that seemed to come from under their boots. Fear changes a city. It doesn't just live in the streets. It gets into the way people breathe. Men who once walked bold now cross the road to avoid shadows. Shopkeepers locked up before dusk, and the police. They stopped wearing name tags. Nobody wanted to be remembered if this thing ended badly. By the end of that week, the rain had turned the Demerara into a brown mirror, and in its reflection, Guyana saw itself differently, not as the land of many waters, but as a place where those waters could hide anything. 5 men were still out there. 1 was already dead. 4, moving closer to their fates, and somewhere among the hills, the siren at Fort Eldridge wailed again, calling names no one dared to answer. Long after the newspapers stopped counting days, the story was still growing teeth. Folk in the interior said the 5 men had turned to jumbies, wandering the forest roads with lanterns no wind could kill. But those who were there, the ones who'd smelled the smoke and gunpowder, knew that flesh and fear were still walking. The National Peace Service called it Operation Riverline. Dozens of officers pushing through the bush, their boots sinking in red mud, their rifles always half-raised. They hunted shadows, but the shadows hunted back. The first to fall was Nigel Croft. It happened near a place called Bamia Trail, where the forest closes over the road like a throat. He'd gone to steal fuel from a tractor yard and didn't notice the patrol watching from the ridge. 3 shots, quick, cruel, final. When they found him, his eyes were open, staring at the treetops. Rain had filled his mouth like an offering bowl. The report called it neutralization. The people called it what it was, retribution. By then, Levi King was slipping deeper into madness. He'd begun talking to the night, saying names that weren't there, hearing sirens no one else could hear. He told the others that the gates had not fallen by accident. He said the world had simply reached its breaking point, and Fort Eldridge was the first crack. Corey Vale didn't believe in signs. He believed in bullets, and when food ran out, he went hunting near Quaquani Creek and never came back. Some said a farmer shot him. Others said Levi did, to keep his silence. Either way, the river kept his body, and the rain washed the blood clean by dawn. In New Amsterdam, the story was changing shape. No one spoke of prisoners anymore. They spoke of the 5 that walked through iron. Children whispered it, like a bedtime dare. And somewhere between fact and fright, truth began to dissolve. The remaining 3, Levi, Randall Hughes, and Eldon Pace's ghost, that still seemed to walk beside them, kept moving south. They were thin now, hollow, their eyes sunk deep into hunger. Each night they built small fires of damp sticks. Each night they argued about what freedom really meant. Levi would say, "Freedom is the space between 2 heartbeats." Randall would answer, "Then maybe we're already dead." The end came at the edge of Bartica, where the river splits and the jungle breathes mist. A villager spotted movement in a banana patch and called it in. By the time the searchlight swept the field, the 3 were trapped. Randall dropped his gun first. He'd had enough. He raised his hands and shouted something no one could hear over the rain. The officer's finger twitched, one flash, one thunderclap, and the man who'd once prayed under cane carts fell face first into the mud. Levi didn't run. He stood over the body, looked up at the soldiers closing in, and smiled, a small, tired smile, as if he'd been waiting for them since the day he was born. He said, "Tell them the gates didn't break." They opened. Then he stepped forward into the gunfire, and the jungle swallowed the sound. By morning, the headlines were triumphant. Final fugitive killed in Bartica siege. The government promised reforms. Fort Eldridge repaired its walls. New locks, new rules, new uniforms. But no one could wash away what the people had already named it. The day the bars broke, because that was the truth, not about walls or prisoners, but about how fragile safety really was. A single morning, a handful of bullets, and a whole nation learned how easily the bars between order and chaos can rust away. When the gunfire faded and the jungle swallowed its smoke, Lyndon breathed again, but not easily. The rain that fell that week washed the dust from the roads, yet it couldn't wash away the weight of what had been done. Fort Eldridge stood silent, its walls dripping like old candles. The siren rusted quiet for the first time in months. They buried Officer Kenton Reed beneath the flame trees, where sunlight could still reach through the fence. In Mackenzie, neighbors gathered outside the Doyle home with flowers and bread, whispering prayers into the rain. Maya and Miles stood hand in hand beside their grandmother. They didn't cry, not yet. Children often need time to understand when ghosts stop knocking. As months passed, the story of the five of Fort Eldridge hardened into legend. People stopped talking about fugitives and manhunts. They spoke instead of signs. Lights flickering in the laundry bay, keys rattling down empty halls, footsteps pacing the corridor before dawn. No one ever opened the door to look. In Bartica, fishermen swore they saw a man walking across the shallows at sunrise. Coat torn, humming a tune the river seemed to know. They said it was Levi King, still searching for a gate that opened into peace. And near Kwakwani, old hunters left rum and breadfruit by the creek, so the spirits of the lost could eat and move on. Even those who never believed began to whisper before crossing that water. One night, a young recruit on watch at Fort Eldridge heard a siren, faint, broken, drifting through the moonlit yard. The switchboard was dead, the wires rusted through. The sound came from nowhere, yet carried every sorrow the place had ever known. He resigned the next morning and never returned. Years later, the prison was no longer called Fort Eldridge. People renamed it something heavier, the place where the bars broke. And every year, before the rains return, someone swears they hear the siren again, rolling down the valley before dawn. Some say it's just the wind through broken vents. Others say it's the walls, remembering, calling the roll of those who never came home. Maya and Miles grew up and moved away, but they never forgot that sound. When thunder breaks over the river, Maya still reaches for her brother's hand. The way they did that morning when the siren cried and the world changed. That was the day the bars broke, not the bars of a prison, but the bars between what we believe can't happen and what does. Because once the impossible shows its face, you can never pretend you don't see it again. And before I leave you tonight, remember this: the events you've heard are real. The pain, the fear, the sound of that siren, all real. But the names and towns have been changed, shifted in shadow and memory, so those still living may rest without the weight of our retelling. Every island has its secrets, and every secret needs someone to tell it. Help keep these stories alive. Like, share, and subscribe to Caribbean Crimes, where the whispers never really fade.